Everyone thinks 1918 was slow. Horse-and-buggy America, right? Wrong. The post office had built one of the most advanced communication networks on the planet. Railway clerks sorting mail on moving trains, same-day delivery within cities, coast to coast in just over a week. An intricate, well-oiled machine. And the post office looked at all of that and thought, not fast enough.
So what was the problem?
Well, like distance, probably, and time. New York to San Francisco by train, still over a week, even with all that efficiency. The country was connected, but it was slow. Business moved at the speed of locomotives, and that's what everyone accepted as reality. This is just how fast things can go.
Until someone looked up.
Exactly. The military had just built thousands of airplanes for World War I and trained thousands of pilots. And now the war's over. And all that infrastructure, all those planes, all those people who learned to fly, it's just sitting there.
And the post office saw an opportunity.
Not just an opportunity. They saw a chance to do something audacious, something that had never been done before. They looked at these flimsy, dangerous machines that had been built for war and thought, well, what if we could use them to move the mail?
This is the moment where someone either gets called a visionary or an idiot.
¿Por qué no los dos, Aileen? Because possibly both. Because back then, flight was not what we know today. There was no commercial airlines, no airports with jetways and terminals, just open cockpits, paper maps, a propeller, and a prayer.
The post office would become the single most important force in the development of American aviation. They didn't just buy a few planes. They built the entire system that would make passenger flight possible. They laid the groundwork for modern air traffic control and long-distance navigation. The military built the planes for war, but the post office, they were about to turn those into a tool for progress.
And they were about to launch a mail route so dangerous, so ambitious, it would change how everyone thought about distance forever.
The Airmail service. And the post office was about to put its entire reputation and the lives of its pilots on the line to prove that flight wasn't just a military tool. It was the future for American communication.
I have a question for you, Aileen.
Yeah.
How fast is too fast? Have you heard about there's like a new plane that can travel way faster than our current airplanes? And like theoretically, you could get from like Colorado to London in an hour.
I don't know how fast is too fast, but let's lock it down on the planes we do have.
Right?
I want high-speed rail before I want that.
Exactly. Act 1, The Audacious Gamble. Let's talk about the sheer audacity of what they did. We're talking about looking at a flimsy, untested technology and saying, yeah, that's our next business model.
It's like pitching investors on a food delivery app, except your delivery drivers are using experimental jetpacks that explode half the time. And oh, by the way, 1 in 6 of them will be dead within a year.
Yikes. And that's exactly what the U.S. Postal Service did in 1918. They looked at the airplane and thought, sure, let's build an entire service around this death trap.
Okay, so context. The Wright brothers made their infamous flight in 1903 in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. But they were from Ohio, my state, which I legally have to point out because North Carolina loves to claim the Wright brothers hard. But they built their plane in Dayton, and I love that Ohioans are like, yeah, they flew it in North Carolina, but we built it, so it counts.
Ohio, taking credit for things since 1803.
Exactly. But here's the thing. That first flight in 1903, 12 seconds long, 120 feet, barely longer than a commercial airliner today. And 15 years later, in 1918, flight was still not a normal thing. It was experimental technology that regularly killed people.
When we say not a normal thing, we mean it. Picture an early airplane. You're sitting in an open cockpit, like open air, as in there's a hole in the fuselage right behind the engine. No glass, no windshield, nothing. Just you, the sky, and birds hitting your face at 80 miles an hour. You couldn't hear anything over the engine roar. You'd land deaf, wind-burned, and frozen.
And the planes themselves? Glorified flying lawnmowers. Single engines that could sputter out whenever it felt like it. It caught fire constantly. A little rain, a little fog, a little wind. You were grounded or dead. There were no instruments, no air traffic controllers coordinating the airspace, just a compass and a fuel gauge. You navigated by looking out and following the railroad tracks. That was it. You were a flying speck in a very hostile sky.
But the post office had just won this massive battle for rural free delivery. They'd spent decades connecting the country by road, and now they're looking at the map, seeing all those miles, and thinking, I bet we could do it faster.
So what do? You go to Congress. In 1917, they got $100,000 to prove Airmail could work. That's about $2.4 million today. Not a ton of money to revolutionize mail delivery, but enough to get started. The pitch was simple. If we can prove mail can fly from coast to coast in days instead of weeks, Congress will keep funding us. Now, to be clear, this wasn't the first time that anyone had the idea of airmail. Back in 1859, a pioneer balloonist named John Wise, they called them aeronauts back then, actually transported the first official U.S. mail in a locked mail pouch aboard his balloon, Jupiter. But balloons could only drift with the wind. What the post office needed in 1918 was something you could actually steer, something reliable, powered flight.
And to pull this off, they partnered with the only people who had pilots and planes, the U.S. Army. On May 15, 1918, the first official airmail route launched. Washington, D.C. to New York City with a stop in Philadelphia.
And this was not a quiet test run. It was a whole spectacle. They held the launch at Potomac Park Polo Grounds in D.C., which I love because when I used to live in D.C., this is the same exact spot where I have a wild hitchhiking story in college. But back then, it was just an open field, perfect for a rickety plane to take off.
President Woodrow Wilson showed up. A young Franklin D. Roosevelt was in the crowd. FDR was Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, so he was probably there in some official capacity, but also because this was the most exciting thing happening that week. The whole country was watching.
The plane they're using is a modified Curtiss JN-4, or Jenny, biplane. When I say modified, I mean they've ripped out the front seat and replaced it with a mail compartment. So it's literally a flying sack of letters.
And the Jenny was a nightmare to fly. Wood and fabric stretched over a frame, held together by wires. You think your Spirit Airlines flight is sketchy? Not as sketchy as this. Pilots called it a, quote, nervous collection of whistling wires, and the joke was, quote, if you can fly a Jenny, you can fly anything. Not exactly a confidence booster.
The pilot for this historic flight is Lieutenant George Boyle. And I'm picturing this. President Wilson watching, cameras everywhere, the entire postal future riding on this one guy not screwing up.
And then, with the whole world holding their breath, he immediately screws up. Personally, I did not see that coming.
The plane won't start. Mechanics check, and they discover the fuel tank is empty. Someone forgot to fill it.
Straight to jail. That's awful. Already a disaster, and he hadn't even taken off yet. An empty gas tank, that's a tragically perfect piece of history.
They refuel and finally get airborne. And then he gets lost. Within 20 minutes, he's totally disoriented. He has to crash land in a field in Waldorf, Maryland, 25 miles south of where he started, going the wrong direction.
The mail, all 140 pounds of it, gets loaded onto a truck and driven back to Washington. It's a complete embarrassment. The public sees this and thinks, okay, well, airmail is a joke, right?
But this disaster is actually the turning point. The post office realizes they can't rely on the army. They have to do this themselves.
So in August 1918, just 3 months later, they take full control. They hire their own civilian pilots and they build their own planes.
And the man driving this operation is Otto Prager, second assistant postmaster general. This guy is a Texas journalist who somehow ended up running airmail. And he had one rule. The mail flies no matter what. Bad weather? Fly anyway. Broken plane? Fly anyway. Pilot scared for his life? Fly anyway or you're fired.
His actual policy was, quote, pilots will not decide when to fly or what plane to use.
And these pilots, they're flying in open cockpits in blizzards, navigating by following rivers and railroad tracks and planes nicknamed flying coffins because the gas tank was right behind the pilot. If you crashed, you'd be crushed and then set on fire.
Oof. In 1919 alone, the mortality rate was one pilot dead for every 115,325 miles flown. Within the first few years, 31 pilots would be killed. If you were hired as an Airmail pilot in 1919 or 1920, you had about a 1 in 6 chance of dying on the job.
That's wild. And Prager, he didn't really care. He just kept pushing. Fly through the storm, fly at night with no lights, fly until you prove this works or you die trying.
What I'm picturing is Prager sitting in his office in Washington, D.C., perfectly warm, sending telegrams to pilots freezing in open cockpits telling them the weather looks fine from where he's sitting, so they better take off. That is a terrifying power dynamic.
Which is exactly what happened. In 1919, pilots refused to fly in zero visibility fog. Prager's response? He said, fly by compass, visibility not necessary. Then he fired everyone who refused.
That led to the first pilot strike. But the point is, Prager was ruthless, and his ruthlessness got shit done. By 1921, the post office had built a coast-to-coast route, but it wasn't fast enough yet. Mail still went by train at night because flying in the dark was considered certain death.
That is, until the post office decided to prove it could be done safely. And that's where we're headed next. Act 2, the Transcontinental Gauntlet.
August 12th, 1918, the post office takes full control of Airmail. They hire 4 civilian pilots, Max Miller, Eddie Gardner, Robert Schenck, and Maurice Newton, at $4,000 a year each.
Which is actually incredible money in 1918. Average workers are making about $750 a year. So these guys are making more than 5 times that.
Of course, though, the job involves a high chance of, burning to death, literally, so maybe it evens out.
Yeah, and knowing that the mortality rate was so high, I don't know if it was enough money. It's a massive risk. It also came with another big perk. The Airmail pilots were the rock stars of their day.
They start expanding immediately. Personally, I'm picturing like baseball cards of all the Airmail pilots, and the kids are like trading them. Yeah. New York to Cleveland opens December 1918. Cleveland to Chicago, Chicago to Omaha, and by September 8th, 1920, the full transcontinental route is operational. New York to San Francisco, 2,629 miles.
But Maya, there's a huge problem.
Oh no, what?
They only fly during daylight hours. So here's how it actually works. A pilot takes off from New York at sunrise, flies all day to Chicago, lands at sunset. Then that mail gets loaded to a train overnight to Omaha. The next morning, a different pilot picks it up and flies to Cheyenne. That night, the train to Salt Lake City. The next day, plane to San Francisco.
That just seems so overly complicated. It's like a weird multi-day hybrid system. Multiple plane, train legs over 3.5 days. Club, another train. Club. That was so good.
For regular people, though, it's revolutionary. A letter used to take over a week, but the post office is sweating because they've barely going faster than all rail service. And they spent already over $1 million, and already 31 pilots have been killed.
Congress is not happy. Warren Hardin is elected in November 1920 and inaugurated March 1921. The new Republican Congress comes in wanting to cut government spending everywhere.
And they're looking right at Airmail and seeing a money pit. Over $1 million spent, dozens of pilots dead, and they're only saving about 22 hours over trains that already work and don't explode. So they start openly talking about defunding Airmail.
Which is classic, right? Like the government finally does something cool and bold and visionary, and Congress is like, why is it costing so much? It's like the eternal vibe of innovation is nice, but also we don't have money for innovation. Have you seen the budget?
Exactly, and it feels so familiar. You hear the same thing today with public transit or broadband or even the post office itself. If it's not profitable on day one, the knives come out. It's like when people are looking at high speed rail and go, well, it won't make money immediately, as if that's the point. Meanwhile, we pour billions into highways without blinking.
It's that short term thinking. It's wild. They couldn't see past the balance sheet to realize they were funding the future of flight.
And Otto Prager knew it. He realized he has maybe weeks before Congress pulls the plug. And the only way to save the whole service is to prove continuous day and night transcontinental flying can work. Not eventually, not someday, right now.
But flying at night is nearly impossible. Remember what pilots are dealing with: open cockpit, meaning no windshield, and it's freezing cold. Instruments are a magnetic compass that spins in storms, an engine tachometer, and a fuel gauge. And that's it.
Wow, magnetic compasses that spin in storms sound so helpful. Remember, no radio, no weather forecast. You navigate by looking down, following railroad tracks. It's foggy, and you're just hoping.
The post office starts building infrastructure: radio weather stations at airfields, emergency landing fields every 15 to 25 miles, just cleared areas where you can try and land if your engine dies. But the route itself, still dark. Without lights on the planes or the ground, night flying remained nearly impossible.
And that's the problem, because as long as mail transfers to trains at nights, airmail is only marginally faster than all rail service. Night flying is the missing piece. It's the difference between a revolutionary service and an expensive novelty.
I personally identify as an expensive novelty. I don't know about you. Prager knows that he's running out of time. Congress is weeks away from pulling funding, so he's making a desperate call. We're going to prove night flying works right now, not when the infrastructure is ready. We're doing it with bonfires.
Bonfires. I mean, I love a good bonfire, but wow. Prager can't wait for Congress, so he stages this experimental relay on February 22nd, 1921. That date is deliberate. It's George Washington's birthday, chosen specifically for maximum publicity.
His PR team was on it. Yeah. The relay worked like this: 4 planes total take off, 2 eastbound from San Francisco, 2 westbound from New York. But each plane doesn't fly the whole way. Instead, multiple pilots are stationed along the route doing relay legs, handing off the mail like a transcontinental relay race. So one pilot flies San Francisco to Reno, hands the mail to the next pilot who flies Reno to Elko, and so on. They're flying day and night through the blizzard season with no electric lights on the planes or on the ground. Just bonfires lit by postal workers and farmers every few miles to mark the route. Sorry, honey, can't go out tonight. I have to light the bonfire.
What's striking is how much of this is dependent on ordinary people, farmers, postal clerks, townsfolk. The government asked them to light the path, and they did. Families standing in freezing fields at midnight because they believed in what these pilots were doing.
And that's why what happens next hits so hard, because even with all that collective hope, this was still unbelievably dangerous, and the danger showed up almost immediately. On one of the westbound flights, a pilot named William Lewis crashes, taking off from Elko, Nevada. He's killed instantly. Prager's big gamble costs a life before it even proves anything. But on one of the eastbound flights, something extraordinary happens, and that's what we're covering next. Act 3. The Hero of the Sky. So, It's February 22nd, 1921, George Washington's birthday. Prager's experimental relay is underway. 4 flights, 2 eastbound and 2 westbound, all trying to fly through the night with no beacon system, just bonfires.
And as we mentioned, almost immediately it falls apart. One westbound flight crashes in Nevada. Pilot William Lewis is killed. The other westbound flights get grounded in Chicago by the blizzard. On the eastbound side, planes are struggling too.
Except for one pilot named Jack Knight. He's based in North Platte, Nebraska, and his job is simple. Fly one leg from North Platte to Omaha, about 248 miles. Then hand off the mail to a relief pilot who'll take it to Chicago.
Yeah, simple. The idea that this was supposed to be straightforward is almost laughable. Nothing about flying in 1921 was straightforward. Every single leg was a fight against the elements.
Fight I would not be personally taking.
Yeah, I'll take my $750 a year. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yep. Jack Knight is 27 years old. He's been flying mail for about a year, and just the week before, he crashed in Wyoming's Laramie Mountains and broke his nose, so his face is still bandaged.
Imagine strapping on a pair of goggles over a broken nose in the middle of the winter. It's brutal. So he's already injured. It's February in Nebraska, and he's about to fly through a blizzard at night.
He takes off from North Platte at 10:44 p.m., and what he's flying with is almost nothing. A de Havilliers DH-4B with a 400 horsepower Liberty engine that roars so loud you can't hear yourself think. An open cockpit, no windshield, and the temperature is below freezing. Wind is hitting his face at 80 miles per hour.
Yeah, Maya and I are at the bonfire.
Yeah, I'll take some marshmallows.
His instruments are a magnetic compass that spins around in storms, a tachometer for engine speed, and a fuel gauge. No radio, no weather reports. And for navigation, he has a Rand McNally highway map that someone literally ripped off the wall of the Omaha post office and handed to him.
It's insane. Imagine being told, fly through a snowstorm at night. Here's a road map we ripped off the wall. That's not equipment. That's desperation disguised as a plan.
And he's never flown this route at night. Actually, he's never flown this route at all, not even in daylight.
But here's what makes this incredible. He's not alone up there. All along his route, postal workers and farmers heard about the relay. They knew what was at stake.
Imagine the scene. It's the middle of nowhere, Nebraska, a winter night. Temperatures hovering below zero. The snow is blowing sideways. And out in the dark, families are hauling firewood into their fields. Clerks are dragging kerosene lanterns to the edges of runways that are literally just frozen pastures. Kids are out there too, feeding logs into the bonfire because if the flame dies, the pilot overhead loses his only guide. These weren't professional air traffic controllers. They weren't trained in aviation. They were teachers, shopkeepers, ranchers, people who understood that if this pilot made it, it meant a new world of connection and opportunity. And that's the part that gets me. The pilot was alone in the cockpit, but he wasn't really alone. All along that route, ordinary Americans turned themselves into the infrastructure, a beacon system made out of human willpower.
Jack Knight later said he saw bonfires at Lexington, Kearney, Grand Island, Columbus, and Fremont. He said, quote, I felt as if I had 1,000 friends on the ground. He could see, quote, warm glows of well-wishers beneath the plane's wing. But between the bonfires, it's just darkness and snow. At one point, he said the fog and snow made him feel, quote, absolutely alone in the universe, roaring through white-black space.
That's the kind of solitude that breaks people. Flying blind, exhausted, and with nothing but engine noise and your own fear for company.
He lands in Omaha around 1 a.m. He's exhausted, frozen, starving. He's thinking about food and sleep, and then he gets the news. The relief pilot who's supposed to fly to Chicago hasn't shown up. All the westbound flights are grounded in Chicago by the same storm Knight just flew through, and the entire relay is about to fail.
So Jack Knight makes a decision. He's going to keep flying to Chicago, another route he's never flown, through the same blizzard while exhausted and injured.
That is nightmare fuel.
Mechanics pour preheated oil and water into the engine to get it started in the cold. He takes off from Omaha at 2 a.m.
And now, exhaustion becomes his biggest enemy. He later said, quote, "I was fairly dead for lack of sleep. I was constantly on the verge of dozing. My eyelids were so heavy." He tried everything to stay awake. He slapped his hands together. He hammered his own face. He stuck his head over the side of the cockpit and let the 0-degree wind bite into his cheeks.
Is that the 1921 version of just blasting Red Bulls? He can't land at Des Moines because there's too much snow on the field. He's flying dangerously low just to see anything at all. He said, quote, once or twice he had to go down and mow some trees to find out where he was.
Crazy. Imagine going out to your farm the next day and seeing just all the tops of your trees cut off.
It's actually how the Bigfoot legend was
Yeah,
born.
conspiracy started. Around 4:30 a.m., he's running out of fuel and he spots Iowa City. The airfield is closed. Everyone's gone home. So he does something wild. He starts gunning his engine over the housetops to wake someone up.
And it works. A night watchman hears the engine, grabs 2 railroad flares, and runs out to mark the landing area. Jack Knight lands with his fuel tank completely empty.
Whew. At this point, the temperature is negative 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Knight refuses to shut down his engine because he's afraid it won't restart. So while mechanics refuel the plane, he keeps it running. They bring him coffee and food, and he experiences brief warmth.
Seriously. Not turning it off. That's the difference between a legend and a footnote right there. The refusal to quit. Your body's screaming for rest, but you keep the machine alive because stopping means losing everything.
Then, at 6:30 in the morning, with some flares marking the end of the runway, he takes off into the pre-dawn darkness for the final 200 miles to Chicago.
And as dawn breaks, the weather starts clearing, and he sees it, Chicago. He later said, quote, the smoke of Chicago mixing with the gray clouds of the early morning is the finest sight I've ever seen. I could see it 100 miles away by the smoke.
He lands at Checkerboard Field in Maywood at 8:40 a.m. on February 23rd. He's been flying for nearly 10 hours straight, 830 miles total, through a blizzard, with no lights, on a route he's never flown.
When he shuts down the engine, a crowd of people who've been waiting all night mob him. Reporters are everywhere. One relief pilot, Jack Webster, is standing there, ready to fly the mail to Cleveland.
Knight tells the New York Times, quote, "I felt fine, except that I need some eats and some sleep. Say, if you ever want to worry your head, just try to find Iowa City on a dark night with a good snow and fog hanging around. Finding Chicago, why, that was a cinch."
So the mail reaches New York at 4:50 p.m. that same day. The total time span from San Francisco, 33 hours and 20 minutes. That's 65 hours faster than trains. And within days, Congress changes course completely. Instead of defunding Airmail, they appropriate $1.25 million for expansion. Jack Knight's flight proved it could work.
The post office immediately starts building the infrastructure to make night flying safe. They design a, quote, highway of lights across the entire country.
These are 51-foot steel towers with rotating beacons on top. Each beacon puts out 1 million candle power, which is somehow a real measure of light. It's about 12.5 million lumens, so just incredibly bright, visible for 40 miles in clear weather.
The beacons rotate 6 times per minute, so you see a flash every 10 seconds, and they're color-coded. Green means there's a landing field at that beacon. Red means it's just a beacon between fields.
They built 616 of these beacons between New York and San Francisco, plus 95 emergency landing fields along the route. By July 1st, 1924, the entire transcontinental route is lit up for night flying.
It's staggering in scale, the kind of thing we usually associate with the interstate system or the space program. But this came first, and it wasn't for cars or rockets, it was for mail. The U.S. government built the skeleton of modern aviation just so that the letter could move faster.
And here's the detail I love. At the base of each beacon tower, they poured these giant concrete arrows on the ground, 70 feet long. painted bright chrome yellow. Officially, they were called day marks because pilots could see them during the daytime when the beacons weren't lit. The arrows pointed towards the next beacon, so even if you're flying in the daylight with no lights to guide you, you could follow this trail of massive yellow arrows across the entire country.
And here's the key point. None of this existed before the post office created it. There was no aviation infrastructure in America. There was no network of airfields, no navigation system, no weather reporting stations. The post office built it all from scratch. Every beacon tower, every emergency landing strip, and every concrete arrow. They created the foundation that made commercial aviation possible.
Many of these concrete arrows still exist today across the American West, often right alongside Interstate 80, because when the highways came decades later, they followed the same paths the airmail pilots had pioneered, the same paths the railroads had chosen before them, layer by layer of American infrastructure, all following the routes these pilots proved could connect a continent. But these pilots flew them first, guided only by bonfires and borrowed courage. Jack Knight's flight didn't just save airmail. It forced the government to build the infrastructure that made commercial aviation possible. Everything that came after, every airline, every passenger flight, it all traces back to this moment.
One pilot, one night, navigating a blizzard with courage and a ripped-up road map. Guided by bonfires lit by farmers and postal clerks who believed in what he was doing.
And that's the power of public infrastructure. That's what's possible when a government decides something matters enough to invest in it, even when it's dangerous, even when it's expensive, even when Congress is threatening to shut it down.
And as we'll see in the next act, all of that infrastructure, all of that public investment is about to get handed over to private companies who will profit from what the government built. Classic.
Act 4, the handoff.
Okay, suddenly, after years of private companies saying that airmail was too dangerous and unprofitable, they're now very interested because the post office just spent years proving that it works. They took all the financial risk, all the deaths, all the bad headlines, and all the infrastructure costs, and now all that's left and all that private companies want in on is the profit.
Tale as old as time. The government funds the risk, private industry reaps the rewards. And in 1925, Congress passes the Airmail Act, also called the Kelly Act. This law authorizes the Postmaster General to contract with private companies to carry airmail.
Here's how it works. The post office creates contracts. A company then bids to carry mail on a specific route. If they win, the government pays them per pound of mail carried. The company provides planes and pilots, and the post office provides mail and payment.
Okay, bear with us here because we're going to get into a few details, but they're important. The original Kelly Act in 1925 limited payments to 80% of postage revenue, a compromise to calm Congress's fear about subsidies. But just 1 year later, in 1926, Congress amended it. The new payment formula was $3 per pound for the first 1,000 miles, then 30 cents per pound for an additional 100 miles.
And here's the key change. They eliminated the connection between what airlines got paid and what people paid for stamps. So now the post office paid airlines based on the weight of the mail they carried, completely independent of how much money the post office collected from selling airmail stamps. The government could legally pay airlines far more than the actual postage revenue.
And this wasn't an accounting error. It was a deliberate industrial policy, the same way the government had subsidized railroads and steamship lines to build those industries. They were just now subsidizing aviation. The thinking was, we need to bootstrap this entire industry into existence. Airlines can't survive on passenger revenue alone. Planes are too small, too unreliable. People are too scared to fly. So we'll use the mail contracts to keep them in business until the technology catches up.
By 1929, the numbers tell the story. The government is paying airlines $11.6 million in mail subsidies. Actual postage revenue, what people pay for airmail stamps, is only $5.3 million. The post office, and at this time taxpayers, are covering a $6.3 million deficit every year. And airline revenue, 85% from mail contracts and 15% from passengers. The mail subsidy is keeping the entire industry alive. In September 1927, there is a massive shift. The post office stops flying its own planes completely. They're now purely a customer, paying private contractors. But they still set all the rules, schedules, reliability standards, and safety requirements. If you want a mail contract, you have to be on time every single time. This forces airlines to invest in better planes, experienced pilots, and maintenance facilities. The mail contract money makes all of that possible.
Then, in May 1930, something controversial happens. Postmaster General Walter Folger Brown calls a secret meeting called the Spoils Conference. He only invites airline executives, the big, well-financed companies. Small independent airlines aren't invited at all. And Brown basically tells the big airlines, you're going to merge. And I'm creating 3 transcontinental routes, and I'm assigning them to 3 consolidated companies.
And because he controls the mail contracts, he has the power to force this. He extends contract lengths from 4 years to 10 years. He changes the payment formula to reward bigger planes with better equipment. He's actively forcing the industry structure. And here's what merges. Boeing Air Transport consolidates 4 companies on the northern route. Transcontinental and Western Air, what historians call a shotgun marriage, takes the central route. American Airways, 82 smaller airlines forced into one, gets the southern route. Eastern Airlines merges as the 4th major carrier. These big 4 would dominate American aviation for 50 years.
It's wild to think about the direct line that 1930 meeting had to the airlines we fly today. These companies that are in the room became the names on our tickets. Well, almost.
But in 1934, there's political backlash. A Senate investigation reveals Brown's Spoils Conference excluded small airlines. Roosevelt calls it corruption, and on February 9, 1934, he cancels every airmail contract. He orders the Army Air Corps to fly the mail instead.
Except the Army isn't ready. These pilots are trained for military maneuvers, not scheduled commercial flying in winter storms. In just a few weeks, 66 crashes. 12 to 13 pilots die. The public outcry is massive. 3 months later, the contracts go back to airlines.
But Congress passes a new rule. Companies that held old contracts can't bid on new ones. So the airlines just change their names. Boeing Air Transport becomes United Airlines. American Airways becomes American Airlines. Transcontinental and Western Air become TWA. Same companies, same planes, same executives, different paint job.
Wow. The most transparent corporate loophole maybe in history. And in 1941, the Court of Claims rules there was no actual fraud in the legal sense when it comes to the Spoils Conference. But that doesn't mean what Brown did was right. He used government power to force mergers and create monopolies. The government built an entire industry from scratch. Then one man consolidated it into a few giant companies. Both of these things are true.
And here's what drives us crazy. We've completely erased this history. Ask 100 Americans how the airline industry started, and maybe one knows that the post office built it. We don't teach it because it's not in textbooks. The story we tell ourselves is that visionary entrepreneurs created aviation through innovation and risk-taking. And yeah, but the real story is that the government spent decades and millions of dollars proving that it could work, buried 35 pilots, built every piece of infrastructure, and then handed it to private companies who renamed themselves to dodge accountability.
And look, we're not saying there's anything wrong with private airlines existing. The handoff itself makes sense. The post office proved the concept, built the infrastructure, and then let the market take over. That's fine. But that erasure of history isn't accidental. Because if people understood what the post office actually built, not just airlines, but the roads, the communications network, the very infrastructure that makes modern commerce possible, It becomes a lot harder to argue that the post office is wasteful or obsolete. The entire framework of how America does business and goes on vacation was built by this institution. But now we're told we can't afford to fund it properly?
It's not until 1952, 34 years after Airmail started, that airlines finally reach a point where passenger revenue alone can sustain them without mail subsidies. 34 years of government life support.
Which connects directly to what we see today. When institutions like the post office are attacked, the framing is always about waste or corruption. But the question underneath is, why are we expecting a public service to operate like a business? Are we funding the post office to succeed or starving it so we can call it a failure?
Because the pattern repeats. The post office takes risks nobody else will take, serves places nobody else will serve, builds infrastructure that benefits everyone. And then, once it's proven and once the market is visible and viable, suddenly there's a chorus saying the government shouldn't be involved. The private industry could do it better.
But the private industry didn't do it. They wouldn't touch it when it was dangerous and expensive. They only stepped in after the public trusted it enough to use it.
So when you hear arguments about undermining and not funding the post office or other institutions, remember, we're talking about whether we're willing to invest in things that don't produce immediate profit, but create the foundation for everything that comes after. The Airmail pilots proved the sky was a highway, but it took a public institution willing to take the risk to make it real. Act 5. Coda, the institutional legacy.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. The post office invented commercial aviation, basically. They took all the risk, built all the infrastructure, proved it could work, and then handed it to private companies who built empires on it.
And most people have no idea. When you think about United Airlines or American Airlines, you think private enterprise, innovation, entrepreneurship, and paying too much for my checked bags. You don't think about the millions of dollars spent building 616 beacons, 95 emergency fields, 17 radio weather stations. You don't think about 34 years of government subsidies, dead pilots, and you don't think about farmers lighting bonfires in Nebraska.
We love the classic story of the rugged individual entrepreneur, but the truth is, the rugged individual flew a plane that was built and paid for by the government, along a route that was mapped and lit by the government. And it's how we remember a lot of our history. The erasure of the public investment by private interest is the final act of our story.
What really gets me is the motivation behind the money. In 1930, 85% of airline revenue came from mail contracts. Passengers were literally a side hustle for these airlines. Airlines existed to fly letters, not people. And they could only afford to do that because the government was paying them more than the mail was worth.
It completely flips the narrative about small government and private sector innovation. The post office wasn't just delivering mail, they were functioning as a venture capitalist for the American future. They saw an opportunity for public good and invested taxpayer money in a terrifying experiment that no private company would touch.
I think that's the whole point of this entire season, actually. It shows that when you debate the role of government institutions today, whether it's funding broadband or sustainably fixing infrastructure or investing in public transportation, you have to remember moments like this. Only a public entity driven by a universal service mandate would take a risk so huge for a reward so unknown.
And this wasn't just physical infrastructure, the beacons, the fields, the weather stations. They also built what you could call human infrastructure, the culture of reliability, the idea that you could get in a plane and fly through a blizzard because those bonfires are lighting the way, and because the mail has to get through. That's an ethos that transcends profit motive. That's duty.
A private company does a cost-benefit analysis and says, the pilots are dying, the planes are expensive, let's stick with trains. But the post office didn't follow those rules. Their mandate was service, not profit. That's the difference between building a toll road to make money and building a public highway because the country needs to be connected.
That distinction is everything. It changes the calculation from what is profitable for me to what is possible for us all. That's the real institutional legacy.
Jack Knight's flight wasn't just about saving airmail. It was about proving that public institutions can be daring, can innovate, can lay the groundwork for everyone's future and not just their own future. Everyone's.
And that's the pattern that repeats itself throughout American history. The military developed the internet, originally called ARPANET, for defense research purposes before it was later opened to commercial and public use. Public universities developed mRNA vaccine technology through decades of federal funding research before private pharma companies turned it into COVID vaccines. The post office did the same thing with aviation.
It's hard to imagine now, but it's like in the 1970s saying, why are we funding this weird nerd internet thing? Nobody's going to use it. That's literally the same short-sightedness Congress had about airmail. It's the quiet, steady, long-term work that makes it work, even when Congress is threatening to defund you, even when private companies are mocking you.
It makes you realize that institutions aren't just lines on an organizational chart. They're built on the dedication of people who show up every day, often doing the dangerous or thankless jobs, because they believe in the public good. The story of airmail isn't just about planes and contracts. It's about the fundamental human commitment to service.
And today, the post office still flies millions of pounds of mail on commercial airlines every day. Yet, the post office and other foundational institutions are still facing threats, whether it's a political attack, budget cuts, or legislative attempts to privatize essential services. The lessons of airmail are a reminder that when you dismantle a public service, you're not just saving money. You're destroying the capacity for that kind of selfless, long-term, nation-building innovation.
So here's my takeaway after researching this chapter of the post office. The next time you see a post office, remember that it's more than a building where you buy stamps. It's the ancestor of the airline industry. It's proof that public effort can achieve what private capital can't. The story is a race, but the legacy is flying over your head right now.
The post office's purpose was never profit. It was connection and service and shrinking the world so that we could reach each other faster. They built the runway for an entire industry, and then we forgot they did it.
But the mail must go through. That motto was born in the blizzard of 1921 and is still true today, not just for mail. For all the quiet institutions that connect us, serve us, and believe in public good that's bigger than any single company's bottom line. Thank you for listening to People of Agency. The institutions are messy. The people in them are complicated, and the fight over who they serve has never ended.
If you appreciate what we're doing here, digging into uncomfortable complexity instead of easy answers, leave us a review. Please share this episode with a friend. It's the best way for people to find small podcasts like ours. Find us on social media at people_of_agency.
Thank you for your support, because telling honest history, that's how we build better institutions.
People of Agency is created and written by Aileen Day with additional writing by Maia Warner-Langenbahn. It is hosted by Aileen Day and Maia Warner-Langenbahn.
This episode was edited by the amazing Kelsey Rippersberg Day. Our beautiful cover art is by Sam Woodring. We have extensive sources for all of our episode linked in the show notes. Thank you to the post office for being the post office and having an incredible story to tell. Support your local post office by using postal services regularly. Mail a birthday card. Send your long-distance friend a piece of mail just for fun. There's no feeling like getting a piece of personal mail.